So a frantic parent recently texted a Boston University psychiatrist practically begging her to save her kids from the youth mental health crisis.
Right, like an absolute emergency.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is this parent had 3 perfectly healthy, completely well-adjusted teenagers. But she was, halfway through some audiobook about the anxious generation and was just utterly convinced that a psychological collapse was imminent for her kids.
And the psychiatrist's response to this panic?
Her response was just, the kids are all right. Literally, they are completely fine.
Which is such a refreshing take, honestly.
It really is. So, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we are unpacking a profoundly myth-busting new book by that very psychiatrist, Dr. Mathilde Ross. It's called How to Thrive at College, a guide to the ups and downs of mental health on campus.
Yeah, and she really knows what she's talking about. I mean, she spent nearly 2 decades counseling students from this ground floor office at BU.
Right. And her core premise is that society has entirely lost the ability to distinguish between a wave and a tsunami, like a true clinical emergency. That is a tsunami. But, a breakup, a bad grade on a test, feeling overwhelmed.
Those are just waves on the seashore.
Exactly. They keep coming, they knock you down, but they are a completely normal biological feature of growing up. So what does this all mean?
Well, it's a radically grounding perspective, really.
Yeah.
Because we've spent the last decade diagnosing an entire generation with catastrophic disorders.
Yeah.
But according to Dr. Ross's clinical observations, a massive percentage of these kids are simply experiencing the standard friction of normal development.
Yeah.
And that friction is just being compounded by some truly terrible habits.
Yeah.
But to really understand why young adults seem to be struggling so visibly when they arrive on a college campus or, even when they enter the workforce, we have to rewind a bit.
Right. We have to look at where they're coming from.
Exactly. We have to look at the pressure cooker environments they're being incubated in. Dr. Ross actually refers to this as the parenting pandemic.
The parenting pandemic, which seems to trace back to this massive cultural misunderstanding of the 10,000 hours rule.
Oh, totally. The Malcolm Gladwell thing.
Yeah. The original concept was just that to achieve world-class mastery, like to become Yo-Yo Ma or Derek Jeter, you need 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Mm-hmm. But that idea mutated into a cultural virus.
It really did.
I mean, well-meaning parents started forcing kids into AT classes in the 3rd grade, filling every waking hour with travel sports and violin lessons, essentially strip mining their childhoods just to secure a spot at an Ivy League school.
And the fallout from that is wild.
Yeah.
I mean, Dr. Ross shares a story of a student who ran into her office having an absolute tear-filled breakdown, utterly convinced her life was ruined.
Oh, man, what happened?
Well, the trigger for this massive crisis was getting a 97 on an exam.
Wait, a 97?
A 97. Because in this hyper-optimized environment, anything less than 100 is processed by their brain as an actual existential threat. The system actively equates extreme, unsustainable busyness with moral virtue.
That is just heartbreaking.
Yeah. And there was this other student, right? A pre-med student. She was working part-time, barely sleeping, basically functioning on the razor's edge of a total breakdown. So she went to her pre-med advisor for help.
And what did the advisor say? Cut back.
Nope. The advisor told her to take on more extracurriculars.
You have got to be kidding me.
I know. The advisor's logic was that since she wasn't currently doing lab research or volunteering at a hospital, medical schools would just look at her application and think she wasn't dedicated enough because she wasn't stressed out enough.
Okay, wait, isn't striving for excellence a good thing? I mean, we want people to work hard, right?
Sure, absolutely.
But looking at the mechanisms at play here, it's like trying to build a skyscraper without letting the concrete foundation cure first. Like, you can force a CPU to run at 200% capacity to get into an elite school, but if you don't install a cooling system, unstructured play, failure, basic sleep, the motherboard is eventually going to melt.
That is such a good way to put it.
We are just prioritizing high-end processing power over the basic hardware. And Dr. Ross actually lays out her own prerequisites for college, and they have absolutely nothing to do with SAT scores.
Right. Her prerequisites are entirely focused on emotional shock absorbers. It's not about chronological age at all. It's about life skills.
Like what?
Well, she asked parents, can your kid ruin a load of laundry and actually admit it without falling apart? Can they pump their own gas?
I love that.
Yeah. Or if they have an argument with a friend, do they have the internal brakes to calm themselves down, or do they immediately spiral? Have they ever failed a driving test and mustered the psychological resilience to go back and take it again?
Or navigated the terrifying, completely analog crisis of trying to pump quarters into a toll booth basket while cars are just honking behind them.
Exactly. The ability to tolerate mild, embarrassing discomfort is a crucial developmental milestone. And what's fascinating here is how Dr. Ross completely dismantles the myth of that 10,000-hour grind using the very person it's often modeled on, Yo-Yo Ma.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
Right. Parents just assume virtuoso like him must practice 12 agonizing hours a day.
Yeah.
But Dr. Ross points out that the causal arrow is completely backward. His joy didn't come from his success. His success came from his joy. He genuinely loves playing.
Right.
And when an interviewer asked him how much he actually practices, he said sometimes as little as 15 minutes a day.
Wait, really? 15 minutes?
Yeah. Because if you force a tired brain to grind for 12 hours, you aren't learning. Neurologically, you are just rehearsing your mistakes and hardwiring burnout directly into your nervous system.
Which raises an immediate red flag for anyone listening to this, Whether you manage a team at an office, or you're raising kids, or you just manage your own daily routine, are you building a resilient foundation, or are you just grinding for the sake of the grind?
That's the real question.
Because when these young adults arrive at college utterly burned out from that 18-year overclocking process, the cooling system breaks down completely. They fall into these terrible physical habits, and then they end up mistaking the physiological symptoms of those bad habits for severe psychiatric illnesses.
Yes, they profoundly misdiagnose their own normalcy. A staggering amount of what walks through Dr. Ross's door isn't a psychiatric disorder at all. It is basic self-care neglect mimicking psychiatric disorders.
Okay, let's unpack this. Give me an example.
Take the massive spike in ADHD diagnoses. Students are constantly demanding ADHD evaluations, and Dr. Ross notes, somewhat jokingly, but with total clinical seriousness, that if a student shows up exactly on time for their evaluation and recites the diagnostic criteria in perfect order, they almost certainly do not have ADHD.
Because they're too organized.
Exactly. A hallmark of untreated ADHD is the executive dysfunction that makes showing up on time incredibly difficult. What those punctual, hyper-organized students are actually suffering from is just cognitive fatigue from surviving on all-nighters.
The physiological overlap is just wild to me. People are treating a flashing, empty gas tank light on their dashboard as if the entire engine is fundamentally broken. They just need to go to sleep.
Right. And another huge factor is caffeine. Dr. Ross had a student who came in convinced she had generalized anxiety disorder.
Which is a serious clinical diagnosis.
Very serious. She was experiencing heart palpitations, a churning stomach, a constant sense of impending doom. But when Dr. Ross looks at her daily routine, the student is pounding energy drinks and massive coffees while sleeping maybe 4 hours a night.
Oh, man. Well, yeah.
From a biological standpoint, caffeine triggers the sympathetic nervous system. It forces your adrenal glands to release adrenaline, which spikes your heart rate. Your brain feels your heart racing and misinterprets that physical data as an emotional threat, creating a feeling of panic.
It's a total vicious cycle, right?
Oh, completely self-sustaining loop. The caffeine causes the physical sensation of anxiety, which ruins the sleep cycle, which then requires more caffeine the next day just to function. But when Dr. Ross pointed this out, the student didn't want to adjust her habits. She wanted an SSRI.
Wait, she wanted a daily antidepressant?
Yep, as a shortcut. She wanted a pill to suppress the anxiety so she wouldn't have to quit her sorority or scale back her overloaded schedule.
Which completely ignores how sleep actually functions. Dr. Ross uses this brilliant analogy of the Bank of America sleep debt to explain the neurology here.
Ooh, I love this one.
Right. If you borrow $100 from the bank, you can't just hand the teller a $20 bill and declare your debt settled. They'd laugh at you. And sleep debt accumulates the exact same way. During the day, a chemical called adenosine builds up in your brain, creating sleep pressure. When you sleep, your glymphatic system literally washes it away.
It physically cleans the brain.
Exactly. So if you shortchange that process by 2 hours a night for a month, you can't just sleep in on a Saturday and expect your brain's chemistry to magically reset. The debt remains.
And that debt just destroys emotional regulation. Without adequate sleep, the prefrontal cortex, the logical reasoning part of your brain, it loses its ability to inhibit the amygdala, which is the emotional fear processing center.
So you're basically running on pure fear.
You become biologically primed to view everything as a crisis. This is why Dr. Ross tells her hyperachieving students, and this sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. She says, sleep is as important as breathing.
Wow.
Physiologically, it's true. You can hold your breath, But eventually, your autonomic nervous system will override your willpower and force you to gasp for air. Sleep operates on the exact same mandate. You can resist it with caffeine, but eventually your brain will claim it, whether you're sitting in a lecture hall or driving a car.
So how does a trained psychiatrist get someone to realize their brain isn't broken, they just need to change their habits? I really love her concept of the imperfect clinical trial for this.
That's such a practical tool.
Because people tend to endlessly intellectualize their symptoms, right? Instead of just altering their behavior. Like, she had this student suffering from severe panic attacks who was smoking marijuana daily, but he insisted the weed was just a coincidence.
Of course.
So rather than arguing the neurobiology of THC-induced paranoia with him, she just challenged him to an imperfect clinical trial. Just try stopping for 2 weeks, don't overthink it. He stopped, the panic attacks evaporated, and as a bonus, his chronic asthma cleared up.
It's brilliant because it bypasses the defensiveness. You aren't asking them to admit they are wrong, you're just asking them to collect data.
Yeah, she even uses it in her own life. She and her family were locked in this endless, frustrating debate about household trash. The garbage smelled, but they felt guilty throwing away these greasy pizza boxes that took up way too much room.
A classic family argument.
Right. But instead of having some grand philosophical debate about municipal waste, they just ran a 2-week trial of composting the boxes. Argument solved. It's such an actionable takeaway for anyone listening. Before you conclude that your brain chemistry is fundamentally flawed, run a 2-week trial of cutting your caffeine in half, or just leaving your phone in another room at night.
It all ties back to what she calls the family dog metaphor.
Oh, yes. Tell them about the family dog.
So, if you adopt a dog, you instinctively know what it requires to be stable. It needs food, fresh water, adequate sleep, physical exercise, and empathic attunement, which basically just means attention and love.
Right.
If you deprive a dog of those things, it becomes erratic, destructive, and anxious. Well, humans are mammals. We have the exact same baseline requirements. Yet we construct these modern lifestyles that systematically deny us sleep, movement, and genuine connection. And then we sit in a therapist's office bewildered as to why we feel like we're falling apart.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We are treating ourselves like machines, but we are animals. And this brings us to a massive underlying mechanism of this whole crisis: evolutionary mismatch.
Yes, the mismatch is huge.
Dr. Ross theorizes that early humans likely had incredibly robust mental health because their daily survival mandated healthy habits. You lived in a small, tight-knit tribe. You did physical labor outside. When the sun went down, there was no electricity, so your circadian rhythms naturally triggered sleep, and you sat around a fire with dogs, engaging in that empathic attunement. So we're basically functioning like animals in captivity right now, provided with all the physical calories we need, but completely stripped of our natural habitats, leading to this erratic, anxious behavior.
If we connect them to the bigger picture, just compare that ancestral programming to the environment of a modern college campus or a corporate office. It is an evolutionary nightmare.
It really is.
You have digital platforms enforcing 11:59 p.m. deadlines, which actively fights your circadian rhythm. You sit immobile under harsh, artificial fluorescent lights that trick your brain into thinking it's high noon at midnight. And paradoxically, you are completely isolated while being surrounded by thousands of people.
Which is terrifying for a primal brain.
Exactly. From an evolutionary standpoint, being surrounded by strangers was a sign of extreme danger. Your nervous system is constantly humming with low-level threat detection.
That perfectly frames this wild story she shares about a student who had a full-blown panic attack in a dormitory laundry room.
Oh, right.
Like, on the surface, that sounds absurd, right? A laundry room. But through the lens of evolutionary mismatch, it makes perfect sense. She didn't know how the machines worked, she was surrounded by unfamiliar faces, and she was way too embarrassed and socially paralyzed to ask for help. Her ancient tribal wiring signaled that she was vulnerable and ostracized, which triggered a genuine fight-or-flight response over laundry detergent.
And what's worse is the way modern society attempts to help often hardwires the anxiety even deeper. Dr. Ross points out this critical flaw in how we handle fear today. We constantly choose avoidance over exposure.
Yes, this is so prevalent.
She talks about a student who was terrified of dogs, literally to the point of hyperventilating. Now, in a clinical setting, the gold standard treatment for that is exposure therapy, gradually introducing the trigger so the amygdala learns that the perceived threat isn't actually dangerous. But today, the cultural instinct is just to sanitize the environment. If a child fears dogs, the parents demand dogs be banned from the park.
Which, I mean, that feels protective in the moment, sure, but structurally, it's disastrous. By hiding the trigger, you are just confirming the brain's false alarm. You are teaching the nervous system that the anxiety is an infallible predictor of risk. You're telling the kid, yes, the world really is as dangerous as your panic implies, and the only way to survive is to hide, rather than teaching the brain that it actually has the capacity to tolerate and overcome the fear.
Precisely. You are shrinking their entire world down to the size of their anxiety.
Okay, so if the vast majority of what presents as a crisis on campus is actually just sleep debt, biological mismatch, or a lack of emotional shock absorbers, how does a professional psychiatrist identify a genuine tsunami? What does an actual structural psychological emergency look like?
That's a great question. Dr. Ross identifies a true clinical emergency by looking for what she terms the big three of early childhood trauma.
The big three, what are they?
They are child abuse, domestic violence in the home, and having a primary caregiver with a severe addiction. If a brain is subjected to those environments before the age of 5, the constant flood of cortisol and adrenaline profoundly disrupts the physical development of the emotional regulation centers.
And she uses this incredibly stark analogy here. She says starting life with a secure, regulated childhood is like an airplane taking off from a long commercial runway. You have miles of tarmac to get up to speed, and if you hit a bump, you have plenty of room to recover. But starting life with one of the big three is like trying to launch a fighter jet off an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean. It is absolutely possible to launch successfully, and people do it every day, but the margin for error is just razor thin. A normal developmental wave that a commercial jet wouldn't even feel can easily knock a fighter jet right off the deck if the launch isn't perfectly calibrated.
And she explicitly highlights poverty as the great multiplier of these traumas. She actually only dedicates one very dense paragraph to it in the book. She notes that if a single paragraph can't convince someone that poverty is a massive structural driver of mental illness, well, a whole book isn't going to penetrate their bias.
That's a powerful way to frame it.
It is. Poverty means living with a constant allostatic load, a chronic stress burden. It means if you hit a developmental bump, you just don't have the financial buffer to hire a tutor or access a therapist or take a week off to recover. It literally turns waves into tsunamis.
I'm struggling with the metaphor she uses next, though. Let me run this by you. She says a child is like a seed that will grow into whatever flower it's meant to be. If it's genetically wired to be a daisy, it's a daisy. You can't pull on its petals to stretch it into a rose, you'll just rip it out by the roots. Your only job as a parent or society is to provide nutrient-rich soil. But if the author is so adamant that we can't change the flower, that a kid is who they are, why do parents and society spend so much time trying to force these transformations? Isn't that a bit deterministic?
Well, it's a crucial distinction she's making. She isn't saying education doesn't matter or that growth isn't possible. She's saying you can't alter a child's fundamental temperament or their biological processing speed without causing severe psychological damage.
Okay.
When parents or institutions try to force, say, a quiet, observant child into the mold of a boisterous, hyper-competitive leader, they compromise the child's internal scaffolding. And this all circles back to the achievement culture. Parents think forcing that mold will bring success, which will bring joy. But Dr. Ross notes this is profoundly dangerous, especially around puberty, specifically around age 12.
Why age 12?
Neurologically, this is when massive neural pruning occurs.
Mm-hmm.
A child shifts from relying on parental co-regulation to peer regulation. Their brain is basically under major construction.
Oh, right. She illustrates this scaffolding collapse with the story of two famous royal brothers who lost their mother in a highly public tragedy. She refers to them as the Mustang and the Thoroughbred.
A really tragic but clear example.
Yeah. The older brother was 15 when she died. His teenage scaffolding was already largely built. He had peer networks, a solid sense of identity, allowing him to process the grief and integrate back into the royal system. So he was the Thoroughbred.
Right.
But the younger brother was 12. He was caught right in the messy middle of that biological transition you mentioned. His childhood scaffolding was dissolving, and his teenage scaffolding wasn't built yet. So he reacted the way a wild Mustang does when it's injured and cornered. He bolted and ran wild. The exact same trauma hit them both, but the biological timing dictated wildly different psychological outcomes.
Exactly. And that concept of a disrupted biological foundation perfectly explains another massive crisis Dr. Ross sees on campus. Only this one is literally being prescribed in a pill bottle.
Yeah.
She points out a staggering medical blind spot regarding women's health and the pressure to conform to societal mold.
Yes, the birth control pill. She actually refers to them as Scrabble score pills because the pharmaceutical companies invent these catchy brand names while the generic chemical names are packed with so many Z's and Q's they'd win you a Scrabble tournament.
It's funny, but the reality behind it is pretty grim.
It's a glaring indictment of the medical establishment. The pill works by essentially tricking the endocrine system into thinking it's already pregnant, which flatlines normal hormonal fluctuations. And a massive side effect of this, affecting up to half the women who take it, is sexual dysfunction, specifically anorgasmia, the inability to orgasm.
Half of women, that is wild.
Right. It works by increasing a protein that binds up free testosterone, which just tanks libido and often blunts emotional effect, making the patient feel completely numb or depressed. Yet doctors rarely disclose this, because the medical system views preventing pregnancy as the only metric of success, completely dismissing a woman's right to sexual pleasure and emotional vibrancy.
This raises an important question, though. How much of what we culturally label as a mysterious depression epidemic among young women is actually just the unacknowledged neurological and endocrine fallout of medications they were put on at age 15?
It's wild that in an era where we supposedly talk about everything, these massive realities for women, from the side effects of birth control to societal pressures, are still completely cloaked in silence.
And this dismissal of women's physical reality extends far beyond pharmaceuticals into the broader culture. Dr. Ross shares a clinical encounter with a former model who was hospitalized with severe malnutrition and dehydration. She had literally starved her organs just to fit a visual aesthetic demanded by the modeling industry.
Which prompts an absolutely blistering critique from Dr. Ross of the modern wellness industry. She specifically calls out brands like Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, arguing that these empires basically manufacture physical insecurities through impossible aesthetic standards, and then, very conveniently, sell exorbitant pseudoscientific cures for the very anxiety they generated.
It's the commodification of avoidance.
She even goes on this whole tangent about the ski slopes at Deer Valley, marveling at a culture where people spend thousands on designer ski suits and gold-plated lodge bathrooms while actively avoiding the physical discomfort of actually learning to ski.
It's all about optics. And that exact same societal instinct to ignore female biology in favor of optics, or in some cases politics, shows up in how we handle reproductive choices too. Dr. Ross shares the clinical story of a student processing profound grief after an abortion.
And I want to be super clear here. Both of us, and Dr. Ross in the book, are remaining strictly impartial here. We are not taking a political stance at all. We are merely reporting Dr. Ross's clinical observations.
Absolutely. No politics, just the clinical reality.
She steps away from the political debates entirely to look at this purely through a biological and psychiatric lens. She notes that regardless of where society stands politically or morally, human beings are mammals. Evolution has hardwired the mammalian brain and endocrine system to relentlessly protect a pregnancy. So when a pregnancy ends abruptly, there is an immediate crashing shift in hormones like progesterone and estrogen. And this is accompanied by a profound biological grief response from the nervous system.
But because our culture frames abortion exclusively as a vicious, polarizing political battleground, women are entirely stripped of the space to actually process that biological reality.
Yeah.
On one side, it's treated as a moral failing. On the other, there is pressure to treat it as casually as removing a mole just to protect the political right to the procedure. Both extremes deny the patient the clinical empathy and psychological space required to navigate the heavy, entirely natural grief of a major reproductive event.
It is a profound failure of empathic attunement. As you said earlier, in an era where everyone is supposedly hyper-aware of mental health, these massive life-altering realities for women are just cloaked in political shouting because they make the system uncomfortable.
So when we zoom out and synthesize all of Dr. Ross's observations, the core message is deeply reassuring, really, but it demands action. A significant portion of the youth mental health crisis is a crisis of biology and environment. The kids are not fundamentally broken.
They're just reacting naturally.
Exactly. They're reacting exactly how a mammalian nervous system is designed to react when you deprive it of sleep, isolate it in crowds, flood it with caffeine, and demand absolute perfection. If we stop overclocking their processors, if we let them pay down their sleep pit, and if we allow them the dignity to develop the emotional shock absorbers to handle the waves, they will thrive.
I love that. As we wrap up this deep dive, there's one final observation from Dr. Ross that perfectly encapsulates this entire philosophy. She points out that botanists know that plants raised in perfectly climate-controlled greenhouses actually grow up incredibly fragile. They shoot up fast and look pristine because they've never faced wind or temperature drops.
But what happens when they go outside?
The moment you take them out of the greenhouse and plant them in the real world, their stalks snap at the very first gust of wind. A plant biologically requires the physical stress of wind and rain to signal its cellular structure to build deep roots and robust, flexible stems.
It needs the friction of the environment to survive the environment.
Exactly. Which leaves you, our listener, with a critical question to consider in your own life. Think about how you manage your career, how you lead your team, or how you parent your children. Are you expending all your energy trying to build a flawless, friction-free greenhouse, shielding yourself or your kids from every possible failure and discomfort?
Because by trying to engineer a perfect environment, you might be accidentally engineering catastrophic fragility.
Right. What if the single best thing you could do for your mental health and the resilience of those around you is to finally open the door and let a little bit of the wild, unpredictable weather inside?
Let the waves crash. Let the processor cool down. Get some sleep.
There is absolute power in letting the weather in. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the real mechanics of mental health. We hope you walk away with a little more clarity, a lot less panic, and the courage to stop avoiding the storm. Take care of your family dog, pay off that sleep debt, and we will see you next time.